Greetings and welcome to the latest IMCCA webcast during the COVID-19 pandemic that we were all working our way through. Hopefully, we're closer to the end than the beginning, but it depends where you live and where your politics are, whether you believe that or not. This is an interesting webcast that we're putting together for this one. When we did the last one that we put together specifically on managing a remote workforce, a couple of people in the HR space reached out to me and said they appreciated the work that was done and the conversation that we had, but they said, what happened to the concept of recruiting during a pandemic when nobody can travel and people can't meet in person? And if you do hire somebody, how do you onboard them? And how do you have them get absorbed into a company culture when you're not seeing them in person and you're not giving them that experience? So that was a really interesting question. I'm hardly an expert on that, but I've invited a few experts to come on the show and talk to me about it. And I'm going to ask them to each introduce themselves one at a time. I have their names listed here on my Blue Jeans platform, and thank you, Blue Jeans, for the platform as well. Deborah, let me start with you. Can you introduce yourself? Tell everybody who you are and what you do.
Absolutely. I work with Polly. I'm a senior talent acquisition partner on the global recruiting team. I've been in recruiting for over 20 years. I've worked with companies like Google, LinkedIn, GoPro, now proud member of Polly. And yeah, it's been a really interesting time with COVID.
Okay, thanks very much. And Les, could you introduce yourself?
Sure, I'm Les Gombic. I'm with the Caldwell Partners. We're an executive search firm focusing on board and C-suite level searches around the world. We've been around for about 50 years, and I've been doing this for, I think, 13.
Terrific. Thanks very much, Les. And joining us again, it was very popular on one of our prior webcasts, is Tracy Brower. Tracy is our resident sociologist, which is going to be able to talk to us about culture and what's going on in the workplace. So Tracy, why don't you introduce yourself as well?
Awesome. Thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate it. I am a principal with Steelcase's Applied Research and Consulting Group. My book is called Bring Work to Life by Bringing Life to Work, and I'm a contributor for Forbes.com and Fast Company.
Okay, so thank you all very much for joining me today. I guess I'd love to hear a couple of stories, and any one of you can speak up if you have one. I'm sure you were all going about your business, doing your job. It was January. We were hearing about a virus that was taking place in Asia, and then it was February, and then it was March, and everybody said, "Go home, stay home. That's it." And how did that affect the process of recruiting that you guys were involved with, or the process of cultural onboarding that you guys were involved? Do you have any specific stories around what happened and what changed?
I'd be happy to share kind of what we
Sure.
experienced as Polly. I would like to believe that we are kind of ahead of the curve since we actually have technology that supports remote workers. But historically, most of our recruiting and interviewing had taken place on site. We made a really quick redirect to move completely to remote workers early in March. I want to say mid-March. Quickly moved to how do we onboard people? How do we recruit people? What does the interviewing look like? And a lot of that kind of happened organically because I think we were all optimistic that it was going to be a short-term problem we were solving for. But it ended up being something obviously that we continue to live in day to day. So we have really, truly redirected everything. And I'm happy to elaborate on that a little later on after others have something to share.
Well, give us a specific, Deborah. Just like what were you in the middle of, and how did it change? I mean, for one of the candidates.
Yeah, I'd be happy to share. So I'll give an example of engineering teams that we help support that typically the interview process would have looked something like I have a conversation with a candidate, the manager talks to them, we put them in front of a technical team, they do interactive whiteboard coding and interviewing in person with the team. And we had to quickly figure out how do we do that remotely? How do we actually get the teams to unify and have a similar process? What kind of online coding tools are there that we can actually have the candidates use that would replicate the same process? So we solve for many of those problems. We also probably, I think the biggest hurdle that you touched on is onboarding, moving from having all of your centralized resources in an office where IT can, have everybody log into their computers in one location on day one, change to, gosh, now we have to ship everybody's computers and make sure they get there ahead of time and get them their log on protocols and figure out orientation, and we do a poly-pal process, so people do have a partner when they come in, but it changed a lot. One thing that also changed for us with onboarding is we moved from doing orientations with a regular cadence in person to all online orientations that we do twice a month. So we try very hard to funnel people into those 2 start dates, but we also have kind of an ad hoc orientation for those that can't start on that day.
That's interesting. Les, what about you? Were you in the middle of anything when all of this hit?
I sure was. I think like all of us, kind of like back in the days, where were you when? I'll never forget. We had a board of directors working with us to find a CEO for their company, and this board was separated by large distances. Everybody was in different places across the U.S. I was sitting in Calgary at the time, and our candidates were all over North America. And we were just about to have the in-person interviews, and those interviews were going to be in Boston. And we were bringing in people from California, people from Texas, and people from other markets into Boston for those interviews. The board got pretty nervous as the virus started to really take hold, and the announcements around travel advisories and sort of shelter in place and just the cautious nature. So we at the time had a long discussion as to what it is that we're going to do around these in-person interviews. Flights were booked, accommodations were booked, everything was paid for, and everybody was about to go. And literally the day before we were about to have these in-person interviews, we canceled them all and we turned them all onto video. So this was a really big decision for this board because A, it was a CEO search, and B, they were a little bit more old school in terms of thinking and how they were going to miss out on looking the person in the eye and shaking their hands and seeing the physical executive presence in person. So that was a big deal with thousands of dollars of implications of canceled flights and everything that we're still working through now.
Yeah, that's interesting. So Tracy, take it from the other perspective. I'm a 100% remote worker. I've been with Poly now for about a year and a half. And I was hired remotely, but I'd met everybody already. They knew who I was. I'd worked with a lot of them in the past. When you're a candidate that's looking for a new role, either to leave the one you're in or because you're out of work and you're trying to find a new role, and you don't have the opportunity to actually meet people or visit an office or understand the company culture other than over video, is that a different experience? Is that hard for the candidates to take seriously, or does it have any other effects?
Yeah, absolutely. It is a really, really tough challenge. And I think one of the things we want to really think about is being so sensitive to that candidate experience. I mean, I always think about that social experience of putting it out there. I mean, no matter what role you're going for, no matter what expertise you have, you're still putting yourself out there to an extent. And when everything shuts down, a lot of times there are perceptions of threat or danger that can come up for people like, oh my gosh, is this role that I'm going for now gone? Do I still have the same opportunities or not? So I think we need to be so extra sensitive as companies, as employers, as hiring leaders toward that candidate experience. And from the point of view of the candidate, I think we need to ask so many more questions. Like, I think one of the things we always talk about in our business is that place is the body language of culture, and you learn so much by walking into an office. You just get a gestalt feeling of what's going on in that office. And when we don't have that experience to go on, it's so important to ask more questions, request to be connected with more members of the team, not just the HR person or the recruiter, internal or external, but maybe also colleagues, maybe also others in the network that will be important to this role. I think those questions are important to ask. And I actually know that hiring managers and hiring leaders appreciate that kind of extra discernment, that kind of extra processing. And I think the other thing that we can be really careful about is lots and lots of extra communication to candidates. We were working with a very, very large software organization who hires about about 500 people every week because they're growing like crazy. They're a software healthcare orientation company. And what they did is they did lots of extra communication to people that they were recruiting and to people that they were planning to hire so that they could absolutely give them that ongoing sense of security as the bottom felt like it was dropping out. So I think those are some of the things to consider.
Deborah,
Excellent.
you have a point? Yeah.
Yes, I would love to add a little bit on that. And I think Tracy's exactly right. There's such an importance, new importance added to more interaction and frequent interaction. One of the things I'm seeing a lot with candidates early on in the process is more fear and more concern. And so we're making quite an effort to be good listeners to people and take a little bit more time to just kind of hear people's story, probably more than we did in the past. Sometimes we're very busy and rushed and we're trying to just get really succinct information and move from one candidate call to the next. But now it's more about hearing people, hearing their stories, what are they going through, asking them how they're doing, I think is really important. And we also are spending a bit more time reassuring people about what they can expect through the process, reassuring them that they're going to be taken care of through the process, having more touch points between the time that somebody accepts an offer and the time that they start. We have an added reassurance going on with people that have any kind of visas that we're working with, because there's just another level of fear with immigration right now. So we're really being very thoughtful about how we interact with our candidates right now.
Okay, that's great. And I guess I want to understand a little bit more from the technology standpoint, because again, I'm the tech head and the geek in this conversation. Before I joined the company that I'm with now, I had conversations with many employers over the years, because I was a consultant. Even if I wasn't going to take a job from them, they may be a client of mine. So it was always good to have every one of the conversations. In some cases, I placed friends at these organizations, people I knew. So, it's always good to have a conversation. I got a call from a friend saying that the general manager of a division of a large technology company in my space heard about me and wanted to speak with me. Not a company I was particularly interested in working for at the moment, but I figured, she's the general manager of this organization. Out of respect, I'm going to sit down at my desk. I'm going to put on a nice shirt and put on a tie and sit down, because if she wants to have a conversation, no matter what I want to do, I want to be there. And I sat down at my desk and I joined using the software that they make, her own product, over video, and she was on a mobile phone walking back and forth in the hallway. Didn't even have the courtesy to have a video call with me. Now, this is before the pandemic, but my experience of that was, look, if this is somebody who owns these video products and isn't even going to use the tool, I'm not going to take that conversation very seriously. And as it turns out, it didn't really go anywhere anyway. But, how have you guys morphed into using the video tools, collaboration, sharing documents? We're at this perfect storm right now where apps are very high quality and they work and they're mostly secure, and bandwidth to the home is there. So I'm assuming video was able to pick up a lot of the slack, at least of these initial meetings. Anybody want to comment on that and how you would use video through the process?
Sure, I can go first. I think first off, there's a lot of different tools out there. And that's caused, I think, some confusion and some problems depending on who you are. I won't name them all, but I think we've all probably used at least 5 or 6 different ones. And in each case, or in many cases, they oftentimes, when you're logging on, to that link, they ask you to download a widget or download some kind of software to be able to get in the first place. So right off the bat, if you haven't used that technology before, it usually ends up where people are late coming into a meeting and they're a little bit nervous. And now if it's an interview and they're late showing up to the interview, they're going to oftentimes be a little bit flustered. So that causes a little bit of a difference of how you start off the meeting to begin with. But you make a really good point, David, with respect to the casualness of these meetings. Oftentimes, I found historically, when you go into an interview, whether it's with a board or a senior leader, whoever that may be, there's oftentimes some formality to it. You have to get to the meeting, you drive there, so you take extra time to prep and be ready for that meeting in the first place because you saw it in your calendar and you had to go and you built around it. Whereas now I find that oftentimes people don't even know what's going on from one meeting to the next in their calendar. They go, oh my goodness, I forgot that I've got this meeting. And they'll jump on at the last minute and they'll be a little bit late and they'll be a little bit flustered. They won't put on that fancy shirt that you mentioned. And oftentimes it's actually even, believe it, to your point around this, in this person, the potential hiring manager, I find that sometimes the clients take a little bit more casual approach than even the candidates, because the candidates historically have looked at it and said, I'm taking this seriously because I'm about to go into this important meeting because it could be my job. Whereas to your point, the person was walking around, not even showing the courtesy. We had one situation not too long ago where the client was eating yogurt while the interview was going on. There's no way that person would have ever been eating during an interview, but because it just so happened to be via, this platform, they took it far less seriously and formally.
Oh my gosh, that's incredible, Les. Eating yogurt during an interview. I'm offended by that, and I wasn't even there. Nothing against yogurt, of course. But, I feel like this is such an opportunity to test culture fit. Like I think about, in the olden days, in the dinosauric times when we had people come into the office and do an interview, everything counts. Like even some companies who will check in with a receptionist after the candidate has left to say, how were you treated and how did that person interact? So I think sometimes candidates can make the mistake of thinking the interview is just within the walls of the conference room during the interview.
Great point.
Everything counts, right? And the reason that's important to us today in terms of technology is everything counts in terms of fitting with the culture, getting connected. Am I able to get connected? Am I flustered when I get connected? Am I handling things graciously when I'm connected? Am I dressed appropriately? And I think the other thing that's such a best practice is putting people into the circumstances that they will normally be in and knowing that they're, under pressure and they may not be at their very best, but also knowing that pressure can be part of the corporate experience anyway. So really feeling like you can test, how does this person come across on video? If this is the name of the game today, is this someone who can translate their thinking? Is this someone who can articulate their thoughts in new and different ways? Is this someone who's been able to adapt in terms of all the changes that we've been going through?
So Tracy, when I had my first interview in the financial services space, they took me out, or my second interview, they took me out to an Asian restaurant to give me the chopstick test. Do I know how to use chopsticks and eat in a meeting? So I guess what you're saying is if you're going to have a video interview, you should practice and be comfortable with the video and make sure that it works.
Yes, completely. Absolutely. And I think there's the reciprocity factor too. Like we tend to think about a company as choosing a candidate, but that candidate's always also choosing that company. So it's, like, is this a company I want to work for based on how they're treating me on the other side as well?
Deborah, you had a comment?
Yeah, I would love to talk a little bit specifically to tools, and we are at Poly really, I think, fortunate that we have multiple different video tools that we work with. But I spend quite a bit of time talking with people about the tools they'll be working with in the interview, asking them about their comfort level, suggesting that they test the tools prior. And different tools work different ways. So we have, if we work with one tool, you're not really able to have one call blend into the next because they can error each other out. So from the how to schedule interviews during the pandemic, it's always good to have space between them. One thing that's beneficial is we can do where we used to do, as we've all discussed here, a panel of interviews that the people would meet with one person at a time consecutively on the same day, maybe in a 6-hour grueling long period of time. You can now spread that out over several days pretty effortlessly. But there are times that we still, using the tools that we have, want to do them consecutively. I just have to coach the candidates on how to work with the tool. The potential pitfalls of not having like their closet shut in the background and having their dog in the room that might bark when somebody comes to the door, things like that. Another challenge that we had with that I experienced recently with a candidate was we follow a process that we have a unique instance for each video interview. So a person is expected to hang up the call, join the next call, and we leave enough space to do that. I had one candidate that I hadn't said that to specifically, assuming everyone was doing it that way, and they had a previous interview where they were told to stay on the same video instance, and the interviewers were going to come in and out. So he wasn't picking up the next call, and we couldn't figure out what was going on. So there's a lot of opportunity for us to be very communicative about what they can expect and how to have a successful video interview.
Sure.
I love what you're saying, Deborah. There's you say a lot of opportunity. I think there's a lot of learning, for so many people. And I think we're still working our way through, this whole evolution. I find that there's a lot more frequency of interviews, to your point earlier, where instead of having a one-day regional assessment center, or what's known in the industry as the RAC, where you bring people together for a full long day of grueling interviews, you can do that over a longer period, and you have more meetings, and they're usually a little bit shorter and a little bit more regular. But that, as we talked about earlier, changes the context for how people approach a lot of these meetings in the first place. So, so that's the one thing. And then also, not everybody is truly comfortable or in a position right now to be able to, perform or be at their best. Because you take a look at all the viral videos of the kids running around in the background with people going through some of these meetings. Depending on the timing, oftentimes there are people that just don't have those quiet settings, or they may not have the bandwidth, or their headset stops working just before the meeting, right? So that has happened. That's caused things to really change. Whereas before, you had a much more formal setting that you could put people in to control the dynamics. And that is completely shifted right now, changing how we all have to show our ability to adapt to new situations. So I think, Tracy, for you, that really also helps to show whether they're going to fit within a culture.
That's a great point, and it was one I was actually going to bring up before you mentioned it. Video collaboration in the pandemic has taken on a new era. We've all seen the BBC interview with the kids coming in, barging in, and or dogs barking or doorbells ringing, and we've all said, "Oh, that's anathema." And now during the pandemic, it's actually been humanizing, and we've talked about that on some of the calls. That if one of my kids comes over on the call, I'm going to drag him or her over and say, "Introduce yourself," and I mean, it becomes a sense of we realize people are human and we're dealing with that. But I suppose during an interview, I'm going to take a little extra caution to make sure, all right, I'm not going to wear the polo shirt today. I am going to actually at least wear an Oxford or a button down, and maybe a tie, depending upon the company or the people that I'm working with. So I guess that formality, while we're much more forgiving of it during the business meetings that we're dealing with nowadays, I suppose in an interview, when you have a very brief period of time to make an impression, the formality is probably still very important. Would you guys think that that's kind of a true statement?
Yes, absolutely. That formality is something that we're seeing as a very, very clear dynamic in companies. Like things that used to just kind of be organic are becoming increasingly formal. And actually, there's a really wonderful sociological concept that says that the more formal things are, actually the more inclusive they are. Usually exclusivity is because you kind of don't know the unwritten rules. You're not sure about the norms. You kind of don't know how to show up or what goes. And the more we can make things super formal, the more comforting that is, the more secure it feels, and the more likely people are to succeed. And I love Deborah's example. Like, it just makes you think, even the things that may seem really obvious the more we can be super conscious of those details, even the things that we're not conscious of because we're so knowledgeable about them, that will really help candidates. And I love your point, Les, about control. Like, we have been able to control that candidate experience. We have less control today, but boy, the more we can give clarity, probably the better in terms of the candidate being able to perform well and us being able to get a true sense of who that candidate is and how they might fit.
Okay, so why don't we take that opportunity, great points, just to pivot for a minute. If I can remember what this was like when I was hired at Poly about a year and a half ago, we had a number of interviews, a number of conversations. I met with a lot of people on the senior leadership team. A verbal offer was contingently extended to me over the telephone. We had to go back and forth on that a little bit, just to make sure that it was exactly the way I was understanding it to be. And when that was finished, I received a formal offer letter saying, "We would love you to join our company. Please sign these documents and return it." All that came by PDF. It would have anyway. I'm a full-time remote employee, so that didn't matter. So now here I am. I've just been hired, and I'm still stuck in my house, and I still have my kids at my dining room table. And I maybe I have an office. Well, I happen to, my office is my trademark here in the basement with all the pop culture stuff behind me. But I may have a space. I may not have a space. I'm not coming into a company. I'm not being given a hat or a coffee mug or swag. I'm not being, I'm not shaking anybody's hands. There's no receptionist that's saying, "Oh, hey, welcome to the building. Here's your ID badge." None of that's happening now. D- You know, I guess I'm glad when direct deposit starts happening and I'm starting to get paid for the fact that I'm on board, but it certainly feels a little underwhelming as you come on board. And is that a phenomenon that any of you can speak to around how do we turn the onboarding into something that doesn't feel like, okay, I just finished a Skype call, so I'm done. What stories can you tell me or experiences can you tell me about that kind of experience?
I'm happy to share a little bit about that.
Sure.
We are, I would say, still learning some of the best practices with this. We did shift, as I said, pretty early on to try to adjust to this, but there are nuances of things that you don't really even anticipate, like needing to get I-9 documentation signed for people before they start, and people needing to go to a notary. But wait, there aren't many notaries that are available right now because their offices are closed, and so you can't access one. So we've had to find backup plans for pretty much everything.
And how
One
dependent the world still is on fax machines, right?
That's right. Fax machines, yes. Or even to the ability for people to have a document scanner at home. Not everybody has that. And, can you legally take a cell phone photo of a document and email it to me and still have it, pass the test? One other challenge that we are still, I think, figuring out is that in the past, we have hired people from all over in different locations to relocate them to a new area. We're being very communicative about the fact that if we're hiring outside the area, that our expectation is you will work remotely until the office that you're working in is opened, and then the expectation is you will be moving there at that time. We have no idea what that's going to look like, right? We don't know when it'll open. We don't know if it opens early and some people are uncomfortable. Can we make them come in and start? Do we have to keep adjusting to people working remotely? So these are still some things I think we have to learn. But we have, outside of that, adjusted all of our onboarding to do it pretty seamlessly.
Yeah, I love what you're saying, Deborah. That makes a lot of sense. One of the things I was thinking about as you were talking, David, is you said, I don't even get my swag. I don't get my coffee mug. I think you still get swag. Like, I think that one of the things that ideally is happening is that the candidate does feel something different. It doesn't feel like, oh, it's the same thing. I just happen to work for a different company. I know of an organization that has a best practice where they send a box of cool stuff to every new employee, and they even have a helium balloon. And so when you open the box, assuming you haven't cut it with your box cutter, when you're opening it, it kind of comes out. And so there are some creative ways to think about how that experience becomes more tangible. I think that's the key. How do I feel different now that I've started working for you, and how do I make that more tangible? I think another thing to consider is how we are extraordinarily intentional about our connections that we're helping people make. They are absolutely positively hard to do when you're a new employee in an ordinary situation. But as we're onboarding people, I think it is about connecting new people to other new people, regardless of age and department. Clearly, it's about leaders staying incredibly connected. Maybe that's daily in the short term for 15 minutes. Maybe it's weekly. Maybe it's every other week. Probably more is better in the short term. I think it is about connecting new people to mentors, even though sometimes we leave that for a year or so, really connecting them to a mentor who's a couple of levels higher outside of their current department. I think too, the thing that can be really helpful is to connect people to a buddy. Like sometimes there are things you want to ask a leader, but it's kind of like, oh, I don't know if I should ask my leader that question. But if there's that colleague who can kind of be the buddy and kind of give you permission to ask the dumb question, that's a big deal. And I think the other thing I would say is make sure that those connections are being initiated by the others to a great extent. Certainly the candidate needs to initiate, but I think the more they get those emails or those IMs or those other reach outs saying, hey, welcome, that's a big deal. And when they are not only task oriented, but also socially oriented. So we put a lot of emphasis on task and we want to make sure people understand roles and responsibilities. Absolutely. And I think the other really big challenge is, gosh, how do I make a friend in this new place? How do I get that kind of social need met? So connections that are super intentional, I think are a really big part of successful onboarding today.
Great thoughts, great ideas. Les, you had an idea?
Yeah, sure. I think there needs to be a little bit though of a hybrid model still, and I know certain states are sheltering in place again, and things are still unknown. But there is, I still think, a need for some in-person, depending on the role and depending on the situation. Certain roles will require a new leader to come in and tour the sites and still get in, especially if they are an essential service where people are still working. So you're still going to need to see some of that. But for situations where that's not possible, I really love the examples that Tracy and Deborah were just mentioning around the buddies and getting a best friend at work. Those kinds of things are important. But I think what's also important is, in addition to the one-on-one that it goes really well with these Blue Jeans and Zooms and all these calls. I find that it is still a little bit challenging, depending on the platform, to have group meetings, because there's the challenge of talking over each other and then who's speaking when and how do you do this, especially when you're new and you don't know anybody in the group. How do you get involved with the group? I'll give you an example. Every Thursday end of day afternoon, we call it Thirsty Thursday for our office, and we'll get together and everybody goes to their fridge and grabs a beverage and we have a group meeting. And this is just a casual, we don't talk about work, and the rule is we have to just talk about what each other is doing or how things are going. And we build that camaraderie as a team and as a group, but it's very deliberate, because if we didn't, it would just be more of those one-on-one conversations, and you lose that group dimension that I think is really important in large teams.
Well, that came out actually in a conversation we had last week about being a remote manager. It's more than just the manager you had in the office that was making sure you came in on time and left on time and signed your time cards. Now a manager has to be able to reach out and understand what their employees are feeling. So the supervisory role in this environment, certainly for a remote workforce, is completely different. The silence can always be interpreted by the employee as being ignored and being unimportant. And you have to take specific actions to make sure that an employee knows that they're valued and that they're appreciated and they get a pat on the back once in a while, and that you have a conversation with them, your drink, your beverage, or a hallway chat, or whatever you want to call it, just so that people are sharing non-work ideas and they feel that sense of camaraderie. It's super urgent while we're all in a lockdown mode for everybody, probably even more urgent for a new employee to feel that welcomed and that comfortable.
Yes, exactly. And I think it's a threshold. It's that gateway to the real experience. Like, I think that in the short term, companies can create the container for those relationships to start. So, one really good example is a company that was doing trivia nights with their new employees. Well, the trivia night is a starting point for then people to get together in person and do trivia night, or get together and go kayaking because they've met over trivia night. And I've always said, this is pre-COVID, I think it's a modern miracle that we are able to spend a few hours, multiple interviews, and essentially get married to somebody and have it work out after so little time together, relatively speaking. And so I always used to recommend, you know what? Have dinner with a candidate, or grab a coffee with a candidate, or something like that, where you get out of that traditional setting and you can really see them kind of in a less traditional opportunity, and you can see how they interact. And I think that's true here as well, really giving that opportunity for people to be away from a more traditional kind of situation, whether it's in an onboarding or a recruitment situation. You can just get a better sense of how they are socially and get a better sense of that cultural fit.
So let me throw a question out at you guys. Talk to me about the recruiting, and I guess onboarding as well, but the recruiting environment. We're in an economy that's in a very poor shape. There are still companies that are hiring, but there are a lot of people that are out of work. Is that having any effect on the process of remote recruiting and remote engagement? Are people more eager to be on these video calls? Are they less eager? Are companies more concerned? And how has it affected the actual process of growth?
I'd like to touch on that actually.
Sure.
A couple of things that I'm seeing. One is, and I think I touched on this earlier. I think there are, with so many people out of work, I think there is a level of fear and desperation with a lot of candidates. I do see it and I hear it from them. It's really important to be able to help them to feel heard and valued. But it also kind of changes the dynamic of the way we recruit people. In the past, I've worked with companies who didn't see a lot of value in applicants. People that were applying that might be out of work might be seen as a less quality candidate than someone that you might have reached out to with a tool like LinkedIn, or even gone to an agency like Less's, or a retained search firm like Less's, to seek out a high level candidate. And amazingly, I'm seeing really great candidates that are applicants because so many people have been impacted. And I'm trying to educate all of my managers to really consider people that have the skills, even if they aren't working right now, because that is such a large population. One other thing that we're seeing just tremendous success with is if we can post a position and say that it's going to be remote from anywhere, which is a big change for all of us. I think everybody's used to having people tied to a specific office. But for those companies that come to terms with, I guess I'll say, the ability to have people really work remotely and maybe continue to have roles that are able to work remotely, we're seeing incredible quality candidates come in that are able to work remotely.
That's great. Les?
Yeah, I think to Deborah's point, there are a lot more candidates than roles right now. And I do believe as well that there is a little bit of urgency on behalf of some of the candidates. However, there are also a number of great people out there who are still actively employed, that they like having the job and they don't want to risk moving somewhere else and be possibly the last one in and the first one out if things go sideways. The devil, they know where they are. So depending on whether they are active candidates or passive candidates, and depending on whether you are going after them proactively and trying to attract them versus, just post an ad and hope that people come to them or come to you, you're going to get a very different kind of, candidate. And ultimately, what you get will be different depending on how you approach them. So that's one thing. I do think that, though, the candidates are now maybe a little bit more open and a little bit more available to have conversations, whereas in the past, those passive candidates might have, overlooked or just said, you know what, I don't have time. Let's face it, people in many cases aren't commuting for an hour each way anymore. So they've saved 2 hours. They've saved that time traveling in between meetings as well. And things are a little bit softer right now, in the economy, broadly. So I think people have a little bit more time. So people that you might not have normally thought you could catch at the last minute to try to get them interested in a role, they might be willing to take a call when they might not have in the past, which is obviously a very positive thing because you can get more eyeballs on your roles that you might not have been able to, get in the first place.
And one of the key points from all of this remote working and the collaboration tools is now that we're spending less time as an industry demonizing the remote worker, we now realize if people can work from anywhere, you can hire the best candidate regardless of where they live, which opens up a much wider pool. And I'm not going to use this webcast to go into the benefits of remote working that I've done, dozens of times before. But, if I can choose to live where I want to live, where as opposed to an hour away from the office, whether it's near family or near schools that are great or whatever the other criteria is that I have, that opens up a huge swath of candidates for people that wouldn't necessarily want to be in the office building every day. They go once a week or once a month or whatever it is. So let me give each of you my last question here. I'll start with you, Tracy. Give us your in this environment, and while we're still dealing with the pandemic, what's your most important tip for employers and your most important tip for job seekers today in this environment of remote recruiting? And then we'll go on to Deborah and Les. So Tracy, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, great question. My most important tip to employers is to let people contribute right away. I think we have gone through a time when employers think, oh, I just want to clear the path for learning and I don't want to clutter everything up. And all you need to do is just learn, quote unquote, for the first 3 months. And I think people are so eager to contribute. So I think it's a mix. Of course, we want to give them space to just learn, quote unquote, knowing how critically important that is, and have them contribute and jump in as much as possible right away. They can't jump in and do substantive work right away, but some contribution is a really big deal. And I think for candidates, I love your point, Les, about last in, first out and some concern about that. I think in addition, we are getting to the point that people can stretch so much more. And so I think this opportunity to really have people try something new, give yourself that opportunity, really think hard about where we might be able to go from here, take on those new opportunities would be my advice for candidates in the process.
Terrific. Thank you very much, Tracy. Deborah, what are your thoughts on that? Advice for employers, advice for candidates?
Yes, I actually have really been processing some of the things Tracy has said and just wanted to share. I really think there's a big opportunity for employers to be very compassionate and empathetic with the candidates right now as we're hiring them and really establish more touch points and more opportunity for them to interact with leaders and coworkers alike after they've joined the company. I think there's a lot of opportunity there that we can absolutely implement. For candidates, I guess part of this is shaped by the fact that I am talking to so many people right now that are not employed, and I guess what I would like to be able to convey to candidates is to not be so hard on themselves in this process, to know that there is opportunity out there. Sometimes it just takes a little longer to find an opportunity. And we want to take care of the people that we're trying to bring into the company from the time we engage them to the time they're hired and onboarded.
Terrific. Good points. Les, your comments?
Sure, and it's probably similar comments for both candidates as well as employers, and that's sort of probably 3 points. Take it seriously. These meetings are, despite the fact that they're video or phone calls, they're just as important as if they were in person. Dress the part, look the part, show up on time and practice. Make sure the technology works. Get on a little bit beforehand. Don't just show up right on time, so that, that things work. But then the last piece on the flip side is give a little benefit of the doubt as well, because you might have still tried and you might have still worked through it, but things go wrong, things happen. Give them a break, in case it doesn't quite go well, and don't just give up on them either. So.
Terrific. All great points. And a very instructional conversation for me today to learn about what's going on in the space. While everybody's coping with using these unified communications tools, well, people who are recruiting and who are being recruited and looking for work are coping with even greater stakes and higher levels of concern. So it's good to know that we're starting to learn how to use these things and have some great tips. So let me just ask each one of you, if anybody wants to get in touch with you, speak to you, get more information. Tracy, let's start with you. How can somebody find out more about you and get in touch with you?
Yeah, they can go to our company website, steelcase.com, or they can find me on LinkedIn, Tracy Brower, PhD, or my email is tbrower@steelcase.com.
Thank you very much, Tracy. Deborah?
I actually would suggest people look me up on LinkedIn. I'm very active on LinkedIn, so they can reach out to me there.
Terrific. Thank you very much, Deborah. And Les, finally you?
Sure. You could go to the Caldwell Partners website and find me there. All my contact info is on the site, on LinkedIn as well, or my email is last name is Gombik, Gombik. So it's lgombik@caldwellpartners.com.
Well, guys, thanks very much. That was interesting and fascinating. Some really good topics for me to learn about the recruiting process and about, if you're looking for work. And we also were wonderfully hit with all of the curveballs that you might get on the interviews, whether it's a broken headset or a camera that's dying or people knocking on your door or doorbells or people, dogs barking. We've had all of it. We were all professionals and we were able to continue this conversation at a professional level, even though those distractions happen. It's good advice for those of you that are looking to recruit people or to be recruited, to be tolerant of these things because it's what we're all living through, and to understand the technology doesn't always go perfect all the time. So thank you very much. For the IMCCA, I'm David Danto. You guys know you can Google me. I'm all over the internet. And until the next webcast, thanks very much, and we'll see you soon.